I'm going to begin now. Everybody's happy. Okay, so hello everyone. I am Anjali Dalal Clayton and I'm an art historian and research fellow at the Decolonizing Arts Institute. Thanks for joining us for this in conversation with Victoria Odeniyi and Paola Georgis. Today's event is part of a regular series of conversations with the Institute's associated researchers taking place since last July. The first was a conversation between myself and Hamad Nasser, which explored the idea of curating nation. The second was between Kairani Baraka and Annabelle D. Antara Crowley, who considered the art school in a pandemic. And the third was between Ileana Selajan and Michael Asprey, who discussed decolonizing global contemporary art with a focus on Brazil and Central America. So a few housekeeping rules or reminders before I introduce Naomi Bouliard, who is your moderator for today. So your mics and cameras are automatically muted for this event. Please accept live transcript if required. Questions can be posted to the chat box at any time, and Naomi will try and pose as many of them to Victoria and Paola as she can during the Q&A session. And finally, please note that this event is being recorded for the Institute's research archive. So now to introduce Naomi Bouliard, who is a linguist and multilingual educator with expertise in sustainable intercultural collaborations. Naomi holds a BA in Asian Studies and an MA in Applied Linguistics, and as head of strategy at the Centre for Sustainable Fashion, her particular interest lies at the crossroads of diversity and sustainability. She has over 10 years' experience in developing and delivering international multi-partner collaborations and has developed awards for intercultural teaching and learning, as well as working on several projects centered around displacement, diversity, and inclusion. Over to you, Naomi.
Thank you, Anjali. I'll be moderating the conversation today. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Victoria Odeniyi. Victoria is a postdoctoral researcher working on the UL project entitled Reimagining Conversation with Multilingual Students. At UL, she's affiliated to the Decolonizing Arts Institute and the Language Center. Victoria completed her PhD in Applied Linguistics at Canterbury Christ Church University and teaches English in a multilingual world at Goldsmiths College, the University of London. I'd also like to introduce Paola Georges. Welcome, Paola. Paola holds a PhD in Anthropology of Education and Intercultural Education and teaches English language, literature, and visual arts in Italian high schools. Her main interest regards a critical, intercultural, and interdisciplinary approach to languages to develop an awareness on how words are used and mobilized in education and public discourse, serving processes of manipulation and domination, as well as that of empowerment and emancipation. Paola has published monographs, articles, and chapters in collective works and has participated in many international conferences. She collaborates with international journals as an editorial board member and as a peer reviewer, and is affiliated to several international associations of linguistics and intercultural studies. Victoria and Paola met through Estidia, the European Society for Transcultural and Interdisciplinary Dialogue, and they are currently collaborating on a transnational project named In Other Words, a contextualized dictionary to problematize otherness. I'll now hand over to Victoria, who will introduce the event.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and thank you for the Decolonizing Arts Institute for organising today's event. As you said, Paola and I met through Estidia, and we share common interests in anthropological approaches to research, language, and critical approaches to intercultural dialogue. And I, in particular, have learned quite a bit from Paola's approach, which recontextualizes words, artwork, and literature in new contexts. And I'll talk a little bit about that later.
So good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Victoria, for this introduction. Thank you for inviting me. And thanks to the Decolonizing Arts Institute for organizing the event. We have actually learned quite a lot from one another through our collective work on the project that we will present later. So thank you.
Thanks. And what we want to talk about today is ways of linking approaches from the field of intercultural communication and dialogue to inequality. Our conversation today is an opportunity to delve into some unfinished ideas rather than to present solutions. We're not claiming to have the answers or indeed any answers, but hope to raise some relevant questions for reflection and discussion. We've divided our conversation into 3 themes and expect that what we say will overlap at times, but also contradict each other at other times. For the first theme, we present our shared views of culture as dynamic, plural, and situated. For the second theme, discourses of inequality, we attempt to link culture with structural and material inequalities. And for our third theme, we'll introduce the online resource mentioned earlier, an online dictionary to problematize otherness, which is currently under development. So I'll just share my slides and then we can begin. So the intercultural has become increasingly popular in global research and practice over the last 40 years or so. It's used to refer to communicative activity, interaction, and engagement between different groups of people, often referred to as cultural groups or cultures. Both Hofstede and Hall conceptualize culture as something that can be identified in every culture and something that is relatively stable and homogeneous. Hofstede, for instance, defines culture as the collective programming of the mind, distinguishing the members of one group or category from people from others. In doing so, adopting a quantitative approach to the analysis of people from different regions around the world, such as the Arab world, East Africa, or West Africa, just to give one example. For many years, I've experienced some dissatisfaction with cross and intercultural training in the Hofstedian tradition, as in my view, they promote solid or fixed notions of culture, race, and identity, which continues to dominate intercultural competence training, particularly within Europe. The view of culture underpinning these solid notions of culture value studies are, in my view, tinged with essentialism. They suppose that people can only belong to one culture and one language, and their behavior is defined by where they're from and not where they are now or what they do in practice. This promotes the view of one nation, one culture, one language, one race, which in my view does not reflect the complexity of who we are and how we engage with others, especially in super diverse cities like London and elsewhere. These essentialist views of others are sometimes reflected in the use of terms like cultural identity in the singular. Markers of cultural identity are dominated by race and ethnicity and the ways in which they intersect with other identities such as language, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic background, nationality, and so forth. So, although cultural identity is about so much more than race and ethnicity, these variables are often conflated, and reference to other people's cultures can become a proxy for race. What can be useful to unpack is what people say about their cultural identity or culture, and should be read as the image they wish to project at a particular moment, at a particular time, rather than evidence of a particular national culture. The second source of discomfort for me is how notions of cross and intercultural dialogue can sometimes construct and solidify the us and the them, who is so often the migrant, the refugee, and perhaps the international student, or those with visible cultural identity perceived as different from our own. From this perspective, people can be positioned in terms of cultural differences, unlike some of the cultural anthropological traditions that I know Paola will introduce later on. For me, alternative perspectives which critique dominant paradigms have emerged. For instance, Giroir's focus on the interculturality with a focus on interaction and active engagement between groups. Ingrid Piller's focus on inequality, and her argument is that so often intercultural communication advice is premised on monolithic and essentialist views of the nation as the foundation of culture. And in that sense, they're not useful to understanding and appreciating difference and diversity. Crispin Thurlow's chapter in the Handbook for Critical Intercultural Communication on language and inequality and interculturality has also resonated with me and helped form my thinking, as well as, for example, Fred Derwin's views on culture as liquid in contrast to solid notions of culture, drawing on Borman's notions of liquid modernity. Indeed, my thinking on the intercultural and possibilities for intercultural dialogue has been influenced significantly by critical interculturalists. And I'll now pass on to Paola, who will talk about her approaches and understandings of the intercultural and the intercultural dialogue as situated and so forth.
So thank you, Victoria, for discussing a critical notion of interculture, which gives me the opportunity to continue with a critical reflection on the notion of culture. In the slide, we can see two quotes on culture. One is by Raymond Williams and the other by the Italian anthropologist Marco Aime. I've been always very interested in words and languages and on how they shape our meanings and our interpretations of ourselves, others, and the world. And I met Raymond Williams on the works on the ground of such interests, and anthropological studies were the further step to try to understand which was the connection between languages and cultures. So let's start with Williams' definition of culture. To him, culture is one of the two or three most complicated words in the English language, and in every language, I suppose. Not only, he goes on by saying that it is not only because of the origin of the word, but also for its intricate historical development, its travel across different disciplines and systems of thoughts. So, to try to approach such a complex notion, we can turn to a discipline that has its core interest of study in culture, that is anthropology. And one of the fathers of cultural anthropology, Sir Edward Taylor, in 1871, said that culture is the result of a process of acquisition, and the Italian anthropologist Marco Aime sustains that la cultura non è l'esclusiva di una persona sola, ma il frutto di relazioni tra individui, e dal dialogo, dallo scambio, dall'incontro che nasce ogni cultura. Potremmo dire che le culture stanno nelle relazioni. So culture does not belong to a single person, but is the result of relations between individuals, and it is from dialogue, from exchange, and from encounter that culture arises. We could say that cultures reside in relations. And Marco Aime goes on by saying that feet first and the web now allow thoughts and ideas to circulate, and therefore cultures influence one another and take out debts and credits. Therefore, each culture is multicultural in itself, but it is also a system in continuous transformation. Thus, with their focus on culture, anthropological studies remind us that cultures are systems and processes that are plural, situated and dynamic, and that we do not belong to a single culture. Anthropological studies warn us about the notion of culture as a singular construct, while it should be rather spelt in the plural. To how many cultures do we belong to or affiliate with? National, familiar, peer culture, etc. And the risk of considering culture as a homogeneous notion will be problematized by Victoria later on. And so can we move to the next slide, please? So going back to words, what does the word culture stand for? What is it mobilized for? What is relevant about cultures? Decolonial studies have widely shown how the notion of self-appointed superior culture has authorized crimes such as the slave trade, colonialism, and imperialism. And similarly, critical intercultural communication studies have demonstrated that intercultural dialogues do not occur on the same ground. We cannot ignore the political and historical factors that impact and frame culture. We cannot isolate culture from questions regarding historical, political, and economic factors. So the risk is using culture as a generic umbrella term, which ignores issues of power and hierarchies between cultures. In other words, the risk is to use the word culture not to speak about inequalities. This is what also Terry Eagleton sustains. So when he says that culture has become a way of not talking about capitalism, and the cult of inclusivity helps to mask these material differences. And he goes on by saying that the celebration of what he calls the cult of diversity has become the best neoliberal, the best servant to neoliberal capitalism and neocolonial agenda. On the same line, Walter Michael sustains that the celebration of diversity has often obscured issues of inequality. And we can read from the quote, as if inequality were an individual rather than a structural problem of society. And he goes on by saying that the celebration of different cultural identities has obscured the problem of economic inequalities, as if the problem of poverty would be solved if we just appreciate the poor. Therefore, how can a critical approach to intercultural communication that Victoria has discussed before can foreground issues of inequalities rather than celebrating diversities? And that is the focus of our next topic, which is precisely on how inequalities can be reproduced or challenged. And I leave the floor to Victoria.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say that I really appreciated the way that Paola, you emphasized that culture can be usefully thought of as plural, and also your comments that dialogue cannot be seen on the same level. And I think this comment reminds me of a quote by the critical sociolinguist Jan Blommert, who said that many misunderstandings, innocent or not, have their origins in inequality, not just in indifference. SITAR is the Society for Intercultural Education, Training and Research. It's a global organization which, in my experiences at least, generally adopts the large cultures or culture as nation approach, where, for example, certain behaviors are explained in terms of collective or individual cultures without further analysis or questions generated. In response to the Black Lives Matter movement last year, SITAR Europa launched an anti-racism learning series, and secondly, a new Africa special interest group was also launched last year. These are exciting and much needed developments. I attended the online discussion about African footballers in Europe a few weeks ago, and the conversations were much more informed and nuanced than the wording might suggest. This is wording from the publicity, by the way. But at the same time, I wonder to what extent the organisation may unintentionally reproduce stereotypes and otherness through the language and discourse surrounding the foreign other. For example, in this example, whose cultural issues are being made visible here? What does it mean to be African or European? Is it not possible to be both African and European according to different situations? And importantly, who determines membership? What about intra-European differences too? Is the reference to cultural issues here a proxy for the race and ethnic differences of the other? Who needs to change? These geopolitical regions, Africa and Europe, must in some way intersect with race, ethnicity, place of birth, legal status, languages spoken, religion, all of which are dynamic, fluid, and constantly under reconstruction in relation to context. Yet this excerpt from the CETOF flyer is an example of the enduring approach to intercultural training where culture equals nation equals race. I'm not suggesting that all of the conversations and all of the training that take place are framed in this way, but I thought that this was quite an interesting and very current contemporary example of how intercultural dialogue is framed on unequal grounds. In contrast, on the right, the image by Alan Schill selected to promote today's event is not only beautiful, but also revealing for me as it captures a metaphor developed by Holliday and Amadasi in their recent publication, Making Sense of the Intercultural, Finding Decentered Threads. The blocks, the cascadal structure here, represent fixed essentialist notions of the culture as nation. Holliday and Amadasi write, there is no question that we are all culturally different to each other because of the way we are brought up in different nation states. But what is important is how we frame these different experiences. The threads, in contrast, pull in opposite directions. They are non-essentialist connections in our lived experiences, which they suggest can help to dissolve boundaries. I have found these solid and bounded understandings of culture to be stubborn, but the metaphor for me has potential for shifting the dominant paradigm in intercultural communication and education towards more dynamic and plural approaches, which focus on what we do in different contexts and time as much as it does where we're from and who we are. And perhaps we can begin to talk about the importance of structural inequalities as well as languages, cultures, and identities, which are encapsulated in the life experiences of so many economic migrants traveling to Europe. I find it hard to talk about race, especially in this virtual space, but I want to try and connect the idea that normative or traditional ways of thinking about the intercultural and to connect them with race, not because I see myself as a race expert, but because I do have some experiences that I think can connect. I've got a few moments now in which I hope to pick up on some of these themes of othering, essentialism, and Paola's view on the discourses around unequal access to material resources. Since around 2016, I've been thinking about the post-colonial and more recently the decolonial perspective on interculturality and how my current interests are bound up in my own personal trajectory. I first encountered this publication caught between a review of research into the education of pupils of West Indian origin as an undergraduate student in the 1980s. The book centres on the special educational needs of West Indian children in England within a context of general concerns about underachievement and discourses of an increasing number of migrants who the authors argue were caught between two cultures, indeed evoking a particular solid notion of culture. These children are the first generation, or were the first generation, of a new experience of completing school in the UK, yet many of them are seen as in-between generation, semi-lingual in standard English, and caught between the different aspirations of their parents and of the expectations of their teachers in the diverse worlds of home and school, to quote Taylor. Reference to the semi-lingual reflects dominant subtractive views of bi- and multilingualism, where home languages were discouraged if they deviated in any way from standard norms, as they were seen as detrimental to learning. Official discourse supported this linguistic and educational deficiency approach. And I quote, "The West Indian child usually arrives speaking a kind of plantation English, which is socially unacceptable and inadequate for education." Now, this quotation, I discovered it several years ago when completing my master's, but still resonates as powerful and shocking, but also underpins some of the problematic ways in which we can position, or ways in which education can position children from other nations, other cultures, other places. There was, and I would suggest still is, insufficient teacher and educator's understanding of language variety, such as creoles and patois, and also the impact of social class and migration, and indeed what to call people. And I think that these discourses around labeling and the implications and outcomes, differential outcomes, are still highly relevant and equally problematic today. They're all issues which resonate in public educational discourses in relation to more recent diasporic and migrant communities. And I'm also reminded to give a second example of a colleague some time ago now, not from UAL, I may add, commenting that they were teaching some Somali students who had problems with writing because they came from an oral culture. And I think that this oversimplistic correlation between culture, and in this case, negotiating and taking on academically literate practices, positions students in unfavourable ways, reducing the possibilities for negotiation or perhaps appropriating more agentive identities. It was also problematic for the students to be judged as coming from an oral culture, especially as it was not known institutionally whether the individuals in question were born or schooled in Britain or elsewhere. This echoes the solid or traditional views of culture and identities introduced earlier, whereas possibly more fluid, dynamic and plural approaches to migrant identity in Britain might provide space and perhaps open up spaces to challenge some of these deficit discourses of the other. But I think more importantly, there are educational consequences of such framing. And as I was preparing for today's talk, I noticed that there was a recent article published in the Education Guardian on the 24th of March this year, which focused on the differential exclusion rates of Black and Caribbean pupils in England. And I think remembering that in Cambridge, for example, Black and Caribbean children are 6 times more likely to be excluded than their white counterparts. So what I'm suggesting is many of these discourses are still ongoing and haven't been ameliorated in any way. And there may be some ways of indeed drawing on different framings, different intercultural framings, which may help open up opportunities for conversation. I'd now like to spend a few minutes, but before I do, I'll pass over to Paola, who is going to continue this theme of education and opportunities for developing critical intercultural awareness.
So thank you very much, Victoria, for your critical reflection on education. And I will continue on the same direction, asking how we can reproduce or challenge inequalities in education, and in particular in language education. This question comes from my own personal experience as a native Italian speaker who can speak other languages, but also from my professional experience as a foreign language teacher in Italy. I teach English language, literature and the visual arts in Italian high schools in an urban context to students coming from different lingua-cultural backgrounds, and in a school environment that is changing very rapidly in the context of migrations. In my practice, I use the foreign language, literature and the visual arts to help develop critical intercultural awareness. From my experience, I can say that in that perspective, it is not so much relevant what you teach, but how you teach it. For example, in one activity, I used English grammar to develop a module on critical intercultural awareness. The focus is on developing activities that can shift the perspective of what we take for granted of ourselves and others. Now I would like to bring forth some examples taken from my book of classroom activities following these three lines: foreign language education, literature, and the visual arts. So I consider the foreign language class an ideal site to develop critical intercultural awareness by using a language that is foreign to all students. Roles and attribution shift, and students who are usually in the background, for example, immigrant students who might be not so proficient in Italian, but maybe more proficient in English, can move to the front stage. And this challenged the invisibility and the lack of voice of marginalized students, but it also shows how roles and attributions are socially and linguistically determined and situated. For example, I remember some years ago, a Polish student who had just arrived from Poland with his family. He was considered a bit slow by his classmates because he could speak and understand a little Italian. Yet he was very proficient in English. So during the English class, his role and attributions were subverted, and that had an impact both at an individual and at a collective level, since the power dynamics shifted. With the same purpose, I sometimes organize multilingual activities, including all the languages and the dialects that inhabit the classroom. For example, I use the translations from different languages and dialects into English as a critical intercultural exercise, since it makes us reflect on our own system of cultural references. As Victoria has said before, critical intercultural awareness begins with a reflection on ourselves and on our system of references. Literature is another perfect site to help develop intercultural awareness, since it offers us the opportunity to literally walk in other shoes and in other thoughts and feelings. It offers us the possibility of understanding from within experiences and thoughts that we might never encounter otherwise. And visual arts are another fantastic resource to help develop critical awareness. I often use works of art of the past to help students detect what is not there, sometimes in comparison with contemporary works of art, such as, for example, the works by individuare or by some street artists. Such works oblige us to shift our perspective, since they favor visual processes of defamiliarization. In Wiley's works, he forces us to ask ourselves who has been visible and who has been invisible in the artistic production for centuries, and what has been considered as a norm in the visual representation. For example, he reproduces masterpieces from classical arts, and for example, among them, there are some stained glass works with a typical Catholic iconography of Madonna and the Child on the throne, but sitting on the throne, there are a black man with a black child wearing clothes in the hip-hop style. Another artist that I often discuss with my students is Banksy. In his words, the process of defamiliarization is often achieved through the combination of two opposite elements coming from different visual and symbolic context, and that precisely because they are put together oblige us to see reality from another perspective. And by so doing, issues of power or violence come to the forefront, as for example, with the image of the little girl frisking a soldier. These works are at first received by students with a sense of surprise and astonishment, but they soon realize that it is only because of what we have considered as a norm for centuries in the visual and artistic representation, and as well as in our understanding of the world, and which have been the processes that have shaped such norms. So the student realized that our way of reading the world can change, can be subverted, and embrace other perspectives. So the issue of subversion is one of the core elements in our project, in other words. And I leave the floor to Victoria for a general introduction on the online resource that we are developing together as an international cross-cultural collective.
I'll spend a few minutes introducing the project and the resources under development. As we return to our subtitle, a language studies approach. So last year, I responded to a call for contributions from Paola through the Istidia network we mentioned earlier. And this is how we met and began collaborating. And like so many people, we have not yet met in person. The In Other Words project is a small collective of scholars and practitioners working across disciplines in diverse locations as Brazil, Bulgaria, Canada, Greece, Italy, Sweden, Ukraine, and the UK. As I mentioned at the very start of the conversation, I was attracted to the way in which a different range of resources were being recontextualized, so taken from original settings, and as Paola has just explained how she uses works of arts and texts in high school settings, but also entextualized, how the resources underdeveloped change from speech to writing. And this is for language learning, but also for developing critical approaches to intercultural dialogue and to learning and activism more generally. We're developing an online dictionary of keywords which are shaped by the narratives of different forms of otherness. The main questions that underpin the project are, which are the most recurring keywords that reproduce and disseminate different forms, and in which context are they used? Who uses them and for which purposes? And how can we develop a counter-narrative? The keyword entries are creative in the sense that the narratives created is often counter to dominant grand narratives. And I find that the keywords are also critical in the sense that they problematize received epistemologies and received knowledge. Given the range of contributions and the range of contributors, a great deal of negotiation takes place around, for example, the appropriacy of different registers across different contexts. There are different traditions of formal and informal registers, and which may be considered more appropriate. Also, currently, we're adopting English as a lingua franca, but are also negotiating and discussing multilingual and multimodal contributions. The keywords already produced are highly situated, but also political, selected by contributors. And an example would be, for example, political troll, and how, for example, the phrase, the internet political troll, acquires different meanings in the political and media language in Bulgaria. I'm developing an entry around conversation because it links with the Reimagining Conversations project, but also as I see the use of the word as far from neutral, and this contrasts with descriptive dictionary definitions. Increasingly, I see conversation, or the use of the word, as highly historicized and politicized, and part of that framing of discourse. Conversations occur about students before they arrive at university. And indeed, politicians will perhaps say we need to have a conversation about a particular topic as a means of directing and dominating speakers, reflecting power relations. The project for me is both a product and process, and conceived as a work in process open to a diverse range of contributions, and indeed multidisciplinary contributions aimed at bridging the theoretical reflections and practical actions. It's one way of promoting critical intercultural dialogue through praxis. And I'll pass over to Paola, who will end our conversation by introducing one of the key words.
So thank you, Victoria. Okay, I will present here the general structure of each keyword analyzed, and then I will give you an example from a keyword that I have analyzed, which is foreignness. But I invite you all to have a tour across the website so that you can see yourselves what it is about, how it is structured, and its purposes. So each keyword is analyzed according to several steps. We start from the etymology of a word, since going back to the roots of a word can reveal rather unexpected surprises. Then we proceed by analyzing the cultural specificity of a word to see the meanings that such a word has acquired in a specific cultural context. Then we go on with a problematization of such a word. So what is this word mobilized for? And the communication strategies. Then we move to the next step, which is the subversion. How can this word be understood from a different perspective? This is the most creative part, since here we can use works of art, pieces of literature, sometimes ironic posts, etc. Then, in the end, we have a series of questions that, since the dictionary is meant to open the discussion outward to the readers, involving them as participants. And by now, as an example, I will shortly present the keyword foreignness. Its Latin etymology, foris, refers to a door, a passage, an entrance, that is to a liminal space between what is in and what is out. Therefore, my research on the keyword followed the concept of liminality and that of perspective, and was guided by the questions: who has the power to define who is in and who is out? And who has the power to define who is the foreigner as such? During the investigation, the concept of foreignness emerged not as a fixed, but rather as a very dynamic construct, which is determined by historical, political, sociocultural, and economic factors. The perspective is a relevant issue there, since it defines the position from which we look at ourselves and others. It is what frames and defines our vision of reality and the meaning we give to it. And as we have seen before, the smallest shift in the point of observation leads us to see and consider things differently. Yet, the point of observation does not come naturally. The heart of the matter is indeed who looks at and who is looked at, who has the power and the privilege to look at, and who is in the subordinate position of being looked at. So the gaze is a political site which manifests asymmetrical status of power. And to offer an example of how foreignness is a notion that is historically situated and socioculturally constructed, and how far it is strictly connected to factors such as class and race, I have analyzed how the Italians as foreigners have been culturally perceived and constructed. And in the US, the Italian foreigners were considered, and I quote, innate criminals, savages, prone to delinquency. And only a few decades ago, what you are seeing there is a sign on a Belgian cafe, which says, the entry is forbidden to dogs and Italians. And please note that dogs come before Italians. Now, Italian foreigners are generally welcomed in the US as well in other countries. So what has happened? And that was the main question that led to the investigation. So who is the foreigner is determined by a series of intersectional factors. And what really strikes as a recurrence is that the same words and expressions that were used then against the Italians as foreigners are now used by some Italians against new foreigners. So that was just a very short example taken from the discussion of the keyword foreigners. You can read this and other entries in the online dictionary. And we invite you all not only to read the entries, but to participate to the collective project with your own keyword or keywords. And you can find all the information on how you can contribute in the entry, how to join in the main menu, or you can write an email to Victoria or to me. And so to continue our discussion on how the keywords, that reproduce different forms of otherness, we are looking forward to receiving your proposals. And by now, we are looking forward to receiving your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Paola. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I realize that I'm not always heard. I think that we've come to the end of our conversational exchange for now. And I'm going to perhaps summarize some themes at the very end, but I would like to pass over to Naomi, perhaps, who will direct us after a short break. Is that right, Naomi?
Hi, yes, sure. So this is the moment now, if you would like to put your questions to Victoria and to Paola and everyone who's listening today on the chat box. So we'll take a 5-minute breaks for everyone to be able to do that and come back at 4:55. I don't know if Hannah wants to come in to confirm the timing, or if we just, Victoria, if you're happy to go ahead, we just do that, I think.
Okay, maybe 4:56. See you all back at 4:56.
Yeah, 4:56, perfect.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Hi, welcome back, everyone. I think everyone's being really shy in not daring to put any questions up. I don't know if you wanted to particularly talk about a certain part of the conversation that might generate further questions, or I definitely have a lot of things on my mind, whether they're questions or comments, but how would you like to go about this section?
I don't mind. Well, I would like to invite questions, but if you know, maybe if we don't have any questions from the participants and audience at this time, maybe you would like to start the ball rolling with a question.
Sure, I'd like to think that everyone's being shy, but I'm happy to read your questions, so you don't even need to put your mic up or your face on the camera if that's something that's stopping the audience. Yeah, I kind of was thinking a lot about a lot of things that you were talking about, and it resonates a lot to some of my personal experience as well. But so the monolithic view as cultures synonymous to nation sort of thing. And although we have evidence now of, in practice, this is not the case, especially if we look at a place like London, certainly we see plurality. And so what is it? Is this, you know, if there's evidence that culture isn't directly linked to at least one nation or even the notion of nations, is it a mindset shift that is required? How do we start to move away if we know, you know, it no longer means that in practice, yet the discourse is still, you know, staying in that sort of old way? How do we shift this?
Well, I think that the question of how is quite interesting, and I mean, when you say that there is evidence that kind of a more plural, unstable approach to cultural identity is prominent in places like London and other super diverse contexts, I think it is for some people, and I wonder to what extent that view or those experiences that you share necessarily resonate with, or how far they extend and to what extent they resonate with others. So I would suggest that, you know, amongst there are a range of different perspectives on the perspective of cultural identity and ways of promoting intercultural dialogue. So I think the discourse perhaps around cultures and languages and peoples suggests that those quite persistent, stubborn, ideologically driven ways of thinking about the other are very much with us. And that's, you know, I think I was trying to suggest or show in the second theme that how certain dominant discourses around migrants and immigrants and people who are visibly different from us and how they intersect with other aspects of identity, how that's been relatively stable. So even though, yes, there's an understanding that from a mobilities perspective, that, you know, the way we are, how we interact, drawing on different technologies for, you know, for daily life is very unstable and changing. I think there are some stubborn ways of thinking about the other, which remains the same. And so for me, I think that one approach is to, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but to extend, I think, the gaze, that the gaze should be as much on ourselves as it is on the incomer, you know, the temporary sojourner, the visitor, the refugee, the asylum seeker. So I think that a lot of the training, the awareness raising needs to take place at home first before it's offered elsewhere or in conjunction. I think that's my perspective. You've got a comment from Alessia, I think, in the chat.
Let's see. Paola, do you have anything to add to this bit, or shall we move to? No.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with Victoria. I don't see that these I mean, there are so many discourses that reproduce different forms of otherness, and they are, for example, in the media, they are made by politicians as well. So I think that it is very, very important, and it is necessary to work on on offering different types of different kind of counter narratives about it. I think it is still necessary. I understand your point, Helmi, but at the same time, what I see from reality is that discourses on otherness are very much present in our societies.
Which kind of leads nicely to Alessia's sort of comment, I think is more than a question. She says that, or Alessia says that we have now reached a point where people are, hi, would you like to say the question yourself?
Yeah, well, Thank you very much first. I really enjoyed this presentation. I love to see the resources and love to actually meet digitally Paola, that I have collaborated before, but I've never met in person. So nice to see you. I wanted to ask you, I work with teachers, and I find myself creating resources and thinking about how to engage teachers in issues that are that can raise critical awareness in terms of different cultures, etc. And I think your example of the African footballers really resonated with me, because I try to find more inclusive kind of resources, but then I fall into the trap, or I think I fall into the trap of othering and creating even more differences because I want to be inclusive. So is there anything that for instance, I really liked the dictionary, and I can already think of possibilities of using that as a resource. But is there anything you can think of for me to help also teachers think about escaping the trap, think about plurality, but escaping the trap of othering at the same time?
Well, I mean, I think on the one hand, as I know that you're aware, that sociolinguistic awareness of languages and varieties is one way into these kinds of discourses. But the example of the African footballers in Europe, for me, it was perhaps one of many, and it wasn't that the convener or the discussants were necessarily essentializing or were racist in any way. I think there was just perhaps a lack of awareness of how these terms or what these terms can do or perhaps do not achieve. So I think perhaps to raise awareness of the consequences of using certain terms and terminology, and to see if there are alternatives. We have these discourses in UK higher education, and I'm sure elsewhere, around labels such as BAME, and whether it's supportive of inclusivity and ways of challenging discrimination, difference and inequality, or whether it simply perpetuates. So I wouldn't say don't use those resources which you think may unwittingly essentialize the other. Use them, but just continue to have that critical dialogue around them. Yes, never not use them, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I can add something, this is not your case, Alessia, but from my own experience, I've seen that several intercultural modules, even with the best of intentions, they kind of reproduce different forms of otherness. So, for example, I really like the idea of subversion, and as Victoria was saying, so also using some materials that we consider that are not appropriate in somehow, but if we discuss them critically, maybe they are more effective than a kind of what has been called the couscous pedagogy, that just celebrating diversities and without considering, as we have said, issues of inequalities. And so, for example, I sometimes work on stereotypes, and I start with the stereotypes. And so, for example, my students start saying, well, but I am not like that.
I think this is interesting because it goes back to pedagogy. I guess you can have any sort of text, and it's the question you ask about it. You could ask kindergarten kids to point out how many capital letters there are. Like the text itself doesn't mean what you do with it is what's important. And so it was quite when you were talking about power dynamic, I think that was interesting, and the sort of the semilingualness and how, I guess we're talking about received pronunciation in the UK, about speaking proper English and that sort of thing. And I personally, speaking with sort of various jumbled up accents, I imagine, you know, it's kind of like, oh, you're not from here, it's the first thing that comes. And that, yeah, so that power dynamic coming from you know, language differences, and it's sort of like, I guess it's that detrimental view that it comes to the front straight away. And how, and this is, I don't want to talk about kind of solution finding all the time, but it's the what you know, why are we in that sort of power dynamic instead of thinking of it as a something that brings richness to others? And so yeah, I understand, for example, the BBC trying to move, you know, to different areas, so it's not just London centric. And I think a lot of it comes with accent and people sort of recognizing themselves in who they see on TV. And you know, we see a movement like that as well, with kind of diversifying actors and all of that, and kind of, and sometimes I feel like the sounds is the last thing that people think about when we talk about diversity. A lot of it is visual. And so I don't know what the question is there, but it's kind of something around power and sounding foreign and other. Does anyone want to come in terms of if it means something to you, what I'm trying to say?
Yes, I think I would agree with your point about power dynamics, and I think Paola touched on that when she said that, you know, some cultures are more or less equal than others. And now I would say that perhaps, you know, I talk about discomfort a lot, and I think discomfort can be hard, you know, it can be uncomfortable, it can be difficult, but I think discomfort can also be quite productive and constructive. So I think we need to experience discomfort if we want to push boundaries or move the conversation forward. And that's why I'm beginning to talk about race more frequently, you know, more frequently than I did perhaps 5 years ago, when I talk about cultural identity, for example, because there is sort of I wouldn't say a growing body of empirical evidence, but there are several scholars who perhaps adopt a more critical approach to intercultural communication and intercultural competence, who do say that, you know, to what extent, raise the question, to what extent is labels of culture, you know, to what extent is it a proxy for race? And I think that when you say it's not just what's heard, it's what's seen, that I think you're kind of alluding to something like that. And that also reminds me of some of the more critical intercultural scholars like Zhihua, who focuses on interculturality as interaction and engagement, you know, in stark contrast to the culture as nation. You know, French people are like this and Swiss people are like that, and so forth. And she focuses on I suppose or has developed a framework where she suggests that we are how we look, we are how we sound, we are how we are on paper, and so forth. So there's different ways perhaps of raising awareness of how we experience some of these ascribed identities and positionings, you know, some of which are comfortable and amenable to us, but some of which are not helpful. And, you know, for example, you know, useful example of we are what we look like on paper is the way in which some people with non-Anglo names with similar qualifications are less likely to be called for job interviews. Now, there are ways of ameliorating those kinds of, I don't know, I'm not sure what I think about unconscious biases, because I think that doesn't allow us to consider some of the structural and material inequalities that you know, cause educational outcomes to be different. But yeah, I certainly think that culture is more about, it's more than language, and it's very much, you know, as I perhaps argued earlier, it's very much about visible differences, but it's almost a polite way of talking about race and ethnicity. It's an easier way.
Anyone? else? Yeah, it's so yeah. There's so much to unpack, I think, here as well. It's I'm quite interested in understanding. To me, sort of like when we move through education and going through higher education it's definitely about being critical and questioning what, you know, what's not being said as much as what's said, and how much learning also happens between the students as much as, and sort of how much the teacher is a facilitator of learning rather than the one, you know, that has all the answers to and the direction, that sort of thing. And I'm wondering, is there anything more than, for example, an institution like University of the Arts, which, you know, we don't teach linguistics or language, apart from at the language center, perhaps, which is kind of seen as a side to the core element of the work. Is there more that we can do in this field, even in an institution that doesn't have languages and the arts, as in les lettres, in the core curriculum?
I think so. I'll perhaps respond to your question, then I can see that Hediye is posted in the chat, and I would invite you to contribute as well. I think there's a lot more that can be done, absolutely. And I think, you know, perhaps because UAL does not have a, you know, a linguistics or a communication or a, you know, an intercultural education department, you know, perhaps that's a reason for greater moves to provide opportunities for multilingual, multicultural, multiracial students to be, you know, to be acknowledged, and for languages to be made more visible. I think the idea of having sort of separate, you know, separate provision is sometimes seen as a broad approach to, you know, languages in universities, to multilingual universities, and I think that certainly on the Reimagining Conversations, where I've, you know, I've observed tutors, and I know that 2 or 3 of the tutors who took part in the project are here today, but I know that there is a lot of creative work that's taking place, and a lot of creative work that's taking place which draws on and plays with that students are pushing boundaries through their use of multilingual repertoire. So it's there, and students have the opportunity, but it seems to be relatively hidden. I can't see evidence of it in institutional discourses on websites. And again, I'm talking about moving beyond having signs in different languages, as Paola suggests, you know, certainly moving beyond celebrating diversity. So I think there's lots of opportunity for that. And students are certainly aware that you know, and perhaps increasingly aware because of the pandemic and the move online, that their creative practice has had to shift. They've necessarily had to draw on other resources that they have, other linguistic resources, because for so long they couldn't get into studios and couldn't experiment in the way that they perhaps wanted to or wished to. So I certainly think there's certainly a room for opportunity for more sort of, you know, from the ground up translingual practices and visibility of spoken languages in classrooms, in the same way that we see visible difference in other forms. But perhaps we should pass over to Hediye.
Just before we pass to Hediye, I just wanted to say to you, you know how London College of Communications is part of UAL, so perhaps there's a situated learning environment there that could be a site for further discussion in terms of, you mentioned communicate, you know, if there was more communication, but we've got a college like that, so perhaps, you know, we're not seeing it in this way, but perhaps that trans-language, intercultural sort of, there must be room for that in discussion. Hediye, do you want to ask a question, or if I don't see you pop up, then I will.
Hi. No, I don't have a specific question, but I, on a daily basis, I deal with different languages. I don't see this personally. Of course, as a teenager, I grew up in Sweden, and I had difficulty. I was shy because of coming to Sweden at a young age, very sensitive age. But today I don't see that as an issue. I don't know, I think I have a far more wider perspective when it comes to words and language and culture and the connotations with the language. That's my only point. There's nothing more than that. And it comes from my personal experience. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned in the chat, isn't the person with the accent or the foreigner the one who has the power or is in the position of power by being multilingual? What do we think about that? Paola, we haven't heard from you for a bit.
In a way, yes. The person who is multilingual has more resources than the person who is monolingual, of course. But at the same time, an educational or a social context maybe does not value that, or does not appreciate that, or does not even see that, for example. And so maybe you have, yes, you have more resources because you can speak more languages. One of the points that came out was also the point of invisibility. And so, yes, you have resources, but you are invisible. These resources are invisible. So that is my opinion on that.
Yes, I think I would agree with both of you, Hadiye and Paola. I think that languages and linguistic repertoires are a resource, and there is a growing body of evidence that if you are a multilingual speaker who can traverse different languages, but also different dialects, different modes, that is a contributory factor to learning. So it is an advantage and a source of learning and a resource. But at the same time, I found that talking to not so much students from Goldsmiths who are undertaking applied linguistics courses, but the kind of diverse range of students at UL, and colleagues indeed, when I begin to ask about the languages spoken and for what purposes and what is the potential role for learning, for creative practice, I wouldn't say that these are new questions for everyone, but they are certainly new questions for some people. And I think it's because of this sort of English dominant monolingual ethos that in spite of the super diverse city that many of us live in, is still dominating. There's an English only dominance, which is not discussed, is not questioned. It's a kind of an ideology that bubbles away. So I would say that you're right to say, perhaps in public discourse, nobody cares who cares, but we should care, and we should care for not only for ethical reasons, but we should care for educational reasons as well. So I would agree with both of you. Thank you.
It's interesting that the UK context, but when I first, so I was brought up speaking French and Japanese, and when I first went to live in Japan, I kind of went on a sort of like a native speaker plus sort of course, so like it's what I think we call linguistic heritage language. So, various levels of fluency in terms of, whatever is fully bilingual. I believe that if you speak two languages, it doesn't matter how you're never going to have equilinguals or one of the language would disappear as such. But anyway, and then the first thing the Japanese teacher said that we needed to get rid of my southern accents. I couldn't possibly speak Japanese with the southern accent. I had to learn to speak Tokyo English, basically. Japanese. And so it's something that you see, and I think it correlates a bit with, is almost like that nationalism, and you know, if you're going to ever be a voice that represent the nation, you must be speaking properly, sort of thing. And so, you know, there's this, it's so important to kind of, I don't know, like how do sort of regionalism and marks of different cultures and geographical area don't become obsolete or eaten up? What can, you know, what do we need to do, or what can we do? Or is it sort of through the conversation? How do we, I'm interested in, for example, people that have moved to another country quite at sort of young adults, and how they haven't, their language haven't adapted to sort of like the different, you know, input from foreign languages in their native country. So they have like what people think of like more pure language because it doesn't have any foreign words, but they're forgotten. And when they go home, people don't really understand what they speak in such an ancient way of speaking. But there's something about preserving, and you know, like it's a different and dangerous terminology, isn't it? Preserving. And so that sort of moving between preserving and adapting. And I mean, historically, we've gone from notions of assimilation, integration, which are all problematic, but there's something of going back to kind of making sure that language don't get extinct, or you know, is there something there that you know, in terms of really talking about diversity, how do we not lose diversity in the current climate?
Well, I suppose I would want to respond. Perhaps will allow, perhaps Paola will respond as well, and we've got a few moments left. I think as you were talking, I wanted to sort of, I was thinking how this notion of a pure language, it's a construction, you know, like so many other constructions, and it serves a certain group of people over others. So I'm not sure whether we can, I'm not sure we can preserve something that from my perspective and my understanding, something that doesn't exist. All languages, you know, the boundaries between languages are blurred and influenced by each other. And I would imagine as we communicate online, you know, across geographies and time, that those blurring of boundaries will become increasingly kind of significant. So that's one thing I would say, but also that the metaphor, you know, of blocks and threads, you know, I find particularly helpful for decentering some of these kind of quite persistent ways of thinking about, you know, race, identity, culture, and indeed language. That's you know, I think what you're suggesting, Naomi, is that there are fixed ways of viewing certain standard languages, like sort of standard Japanese and standard British English and so forth. But there are also ways in which those languages and ways of viewing the world adapt across time and space. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I think I would even push further that language need to adapt, and like you say, you both have said, it's dynamic, and you know, it's living languages, aren't they? So for that purpose, yeah, great. Paola?
Yeah, I was just considering that again. To me, this is again a kind of yes, an issue of power and hierarchies. What is the standard? And for example, as you have been describing the UK context, the Italian context is totally different, of course, because we have many dialects in Italy. And for example, I was the first generation that I was not allowed to speak dialect when I was a child, because my grandparents, they spoke dialect, and my parents didn't want me to speak in dialect with me. So I can understand dialect, but I cannot speak dialect. And that was a kind of, in those days, was a form of emancipation.
Interesting what you talked about, like emancipation, and I imagine a lot of migrant parents have thought the same about not wanting to speak own children because you think you're doing them right by speaking, you know, however little English, French, whatever your, you know, host language is. And I guess hopefully we in a better position in that understanding, but we're still far away, I think. And to be able to, I imagine, you know, but I guess my final question, because we're coming to an end, I guess, is what would a classroom of the future look like in terms of pedagogies? What's happening? This is, you know, everything that we hoped for happened, and this is now you're showcasing the classroom of the future. What's happening? What does the teacher do? What are the students doing?
Wow.
Yes.
Well, personally, I'm still at the phase where I'm understanding what the right questions to ask are. I don't think I can possibly say what an ideal classroom would look like. I suppose an ideal classroom cannot have completely equitable outcomes, but I think that fairer outcomes for more people. And in terms of language and cultures, I think it would be a classroom in which we've said that, that perhaps if intercultural training of some kind or intercultural education is explored, it's where we get to know ourselves first, and the gaze is on ourselves, understanding who we are before we focus on the other, the exotic other. That's one thing. And then secondly, for me, I think an ideal classroom would be one where we not only see fleeting snapshots of other languages and other scripts, but where we routinely, even in monolingual Britain, we hear routinely languages other than English, and that there is a greater acceptance and tolerance that you don't need to understand all of every language in order to learn, negotiate, and become successful students and practitioners. I think that's a little of what I would hope for. I'm not sure how to get there, though.
Paola?
Yeah, I do agree with Victoria. I do not have a precise answer to that question because it's a very complex and difficult question, and it's all about what it is in progress. And so I don't think that there is a definite solution or a definite answer to that, because whenever you get into a classroom, you realize that everything is in progress. And so I think that what is very relevant is to see diversities, not to celebrate diversity, but actually to see diversities, and to see resources as well, to see different resources, and to start from different resources. And but this is a work in progress, and I don't have a definite answer.
Yeah, of course. It was obviously a very tongue-in-cheek question, and I think, I mean, would the classroom be a classroom? You know, there's so many things that come to play anyway. But I think, I guess it's about. I like what you said about the gaze being on ourselves, and so what is the problematic with hearing and seeing languages that we don't understand, and having comfort in it being okay that, you know, we don't need it. This is what's happening with the students, and if I don't understand it, that doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. And I think there's a lot of that in terms of how much comforts you, how comfortable a tutor can be in that, and yeah, and learning to be okay with it from yourself. So not other people being your problem, but sort of like letting things be and staying in that moment, I think. Yeah. There's a lot to be said, I think. Great. I see that we are slightly over time. Victoria, do you have any closing remarks for us?
Not really. I mean, as you were speaking, the words sort of constructive discomfort popped into my head again, and I think that's perhaps what we need to engage with, as well as to continue to think about the vocabulary that we need to talk about difference. You know, I'm struggling with the right words to talk about some of these issues around proxy for race and so forth. So that's it from me. Thank you so much.
And speaking about how to use words, how to be careful on the words that we use, I thank you all very much, and I invite you all to have a tour on our dictionary.
Great.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much.
Paola
Thank you
and
so much.
Victoria. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye. Bye-bye.